Today, we're going to talk about how do you actually implement AI in your business. To do this, we're going to go back to a story that started in the 60s and the 70s. And we're going to look at where AI came from and why it exists the way that it does today, and why you, as a medium or small business owner, can actually afford AI now when you couldn't just a few years ago. So the first piece is Charles. Charles is a deep learning model. Charles is an old English gentleman from the 1800s. He frequents the best clubs. He drinks the highest grade of whiskey possible. He has the most expensive cigars. He's really expensive, and he's extremely customized. He's bespoke. Here's what he's good at. He's good at seeing connections within data. He's good at recognizing complex patterns. He's great at extracting high-level features from noisy data. Charles has been around for a long time. The predecessor of Charles, which is neural networks, existed in the 60s and the 70s. There were research papers written about it. There was some progress made with it, but hardware and architectures just weren't quite ready for it. Recently, in recent years, people started realizing that these ideas of neural networks, if we started layering them more, we could get better results. And the computer hardware had caught up. And that's what we get this concept of deep learning. They're called deep neural networks. So they're neural networks that have lots of layers. That doesn't have to make a lot of sense to you right now, but that's where the term deep comes from. These guys have been around for a while. And Google's been using them. Most of the big companies have been using them for little pieces of their system here and there. But they've rarely been available to medium and small size enterprises because they're so expensive. You have to hire expensive people. You have to have lots of good, clean data, which usually you don't have if you're a medium to small enterprise. And then you need to know exactly how to put all this together, and it's got to make you more money than you spent on it. Well, then this new architecture came out, changed everything. It was this team at Google that was working on a language translator, a machine language translator from German to English. It came out in 2017. And they said, hey, we came up with this new architecture. And if we do it this way, it's called the attention mechanism. If we do our deep learning architecture this way, we get way better results for machine translation from English to German. It sounds like not that big a deal. But other people started taking notice and going, hey, we're working on deep learning architectures. Can we use that? And people started doing it. Well, 5 years later, obviously there's a lot of stuff going on in between as people are figuring it out, what they can do with this new transformer architecture. 5 years later, we get Stable Diffusion public release. And this is where you can say, give me a photo of an astronaut riding a horse. And boom, this model produces it. And then, of course, the famous ChatGPT public release came out that same year in November. And ChatGPT really hit the public, where we'd already been working with AI for a long time through deep learning models and other kinds like reinforcement learning. And we started seeing some of these wows with things like Stable Diffusion. But ChatGPT was really the first time where a layperson like you or me could go in and go, hey, tell me about the best restaurants in Upper Manhattan and give me a plan to hit them over the next month, mostly on Thursdays and sometimes Tuesdays. And it actually produced something coherent. No one had really seen that before. Well, this was all built on top of this new transformer architecture, which was built on top of deep neural networks. Okay, so all this came from Charles. So let's put some more characters to this. So Stable Diffusion, we'll start with that one. We'll call her May. She's an artist. She generates images. There's a lot of models. It's not just Stable Diffusion anymore these days. There's a lot of models that can do this. If you use ChatGPT, it's Dolly. And so May is really good at generating images. She's really good at editing images. She can do it in a lot of different styles. And she can do photorealistic, she can do more animation, whatever you want really. But the key is that she's cheap. she's not actually cheap. She's actually an incredibly expensive model to train, but she's cheap to you. You didn't have to train her. And what these models, these new ones that are coming out, the key difference is that the company that made them spent the money to train them, but they trained them in a general way so that you can use them in your situation. They're trained on so much information that they're actually good at answering the questions that your company has, because most image processing is actually very, standard. The base of it is very standard. And so you can train a model that could work for most use cases. And then they rent that model out to you, or maybe give it away for free if they're trying to get you as a long-term customer. And so you get to use it for cheap. The other one, and the one that's more impactful for businesses, we'll call Barry. Barry is a large language model. He is ChatGPT. He's Anthropic. He's not necessarily Anthropic, but he's one of the models coming out of Anthropic. And Barry is probably the one you're most familiar with. Barry is also cheap. He's great at conversation. He's great at summarization. He's great at translation. He's good at simple logic, and he's good at simple math. But he also is one of those people that he'll always tell you the answer, even if he doesn't know, and he actually thinks he does. And so you have to really be careful with Barry. What is he telling you? You can't fully rely on him. And that's actually true of May and a lot of AI in general. But he's really useful because he can do so many different things, almost anything with language, and even some things with math. So really the question is, where do you put this in your company? Well, let's just take a company as an example that makes custom pieces of art on products or garments. And the way they operate is they have a business model where they receive this client request. And the client says, hey, I've got this high school that I want to make a bunch of homecoming mugs for this high school. And here's our logo. But the logo is not quite right. Maybe the colors are slightly wrong, or the one I'm giving you is way too small or something like that. But here it is. I don't have another one. And I want this on the mugs, and I need to know how much it's going to cost, when you can get it to me, and whether I can get it in time for homecoming. So let's take this company and let's go through and ask ourselves, where could we add AI here? The key that I think is missed by a lot of people, a lot of talks, is that AI is not something that you just put into this big mist and then you put your business into it, and then AI just does something in your business, and then your business is transformed. Your business processes should not change very much. In fact, they should only change in specific places, and they should just be made better in those places. There are specific places you shouldn't put AI. There's some things that AI is not as good as what you're currently doing. And the places that AI is good, it needs to be surgically inserted. So let's go through this as an example. So you receive the client request. We're making your typical flowchart. You have a functioning business already. So you're already doing something. Maybe you have a web form, maybe you have an Excel order form, maybe a paper form. It kind of depends what your business is doing. After you receive this client request, then you create a custom image. You almost for sure have a team of artists. Maybe they're onshore, maybe they're offshore. They're good at maybe Adobe Illustrator or CorelDRAW or something like that. And they take the client image and then they convert it to a vector image, and then you create a quote. You keep this image here, you're going to put it together with the quote at the end. Create this quote. The quote, you need to make money. You need to know the timeline where you're going to deliver it, because custom things are almost always for special occasions. So if you miss the deadline, you got an angry customer and they're probably not going to pay you. So you've got to have accurate quoting, got to make money, got to hit the timeline. And then you package all this up and you send it to the customer. So you're already doing this. In your quoting process, maybe it's a website and like an internal admin portal or CMS. Maybe it's an Excel sheet. who knows what it is. And then you send it to the customer. This is probably some kind of email. If you're a really, really big scale company, then maybe this is completely automated. But if you're doing it for high schools, there's a really good chance that it's not automated, that this is actually the personal touch that people are buying from you instead of that big one online, because they know that you're going to take care of them. So what do you do? Where do you put AI into this? Well, let's think back to the characters that we had. Okay, so we had Charles, deep learning models, expensive, but really, really good at customizing things. We have May, she's great at image processing, relatively cheap, related to Charles. And then we have Barry, large language model, great at summarizing things, great at simple logic, but he can lie, so you have to be careful. So let's start with the client request. What can we do there? Well, here's the next thing you have to do. You have to ask, is this primarily an algorithmic or a creative step in my process? Let me explain what I mean. Algorithmic is a big word, but the way to think about it is algorithmic says, hey, I have a new employee come in. Can I teach this new employee? Let's say that Wesley comes in and I say, hey, Wesley, here's how the client request works. You get this form. You check the form. Is anything missing? If something's missing, then you need to send this email back to the customer. If nothing is missing, then you need to go and send this to the art department. Now, when you send it to the art department, you need to attach X, Y, and Z. If Wesley can fully understand what I'm doing after I explain it to him, and then Wesley can perform his tasks, and then I can go back and check him and say, hey, you did this part right, you did this part wrong, then we have an algorithmic process. It has an input and a consistent output. Most businesses are primarily algorithmic processes because businesses have to be consistent. And if you don't have a consistent process, probably not going to have a successful business. Okay, so that's the really good news, because AI is really good at algorithmic processes. AI is actually not that great at creative processes. I know that's kind of counterintuitive to what we think, but we'll talk about that some more. So this one is primarily an algorithmic process. Now, creating a custom image. There's probably some creativity there. You could say, well, maybe they say, hey, I want a grayish color on the eagle. Or, hey, I want a slightly different eagle, or I want his beak to look a little different. So there's some creativity there. The artist might have to interpret it. But then you have to realize that the ultimate decision is still coming from the customer, who's going to have to approve it. And so the customer's waiting for a specific output that the artist doesn't even know. So there is some creativity here, but if you're doing this at a reasonable price, you're not making one-of-a-kind art pieces. Ultimately, for most of these kinds of businesses, this is still an algorithmic process where there's a specific requirement from a customer that should turn into a specific thing. And if you're doing something that's way more custom than this, then maybe this is creative, but you're probably going to have a different business model than the one I'm talking about here. There's still ways to use AI if it's not algorithmic, but we'll say it's algorithmic for this use case. And then we're going to create a quote. That's algorithmic. It has to be. And hopefully you've got really good timeline generation based on your best guess, your best feeling, your past experience. I'm guessing if it's sitting in an Excel, the way that those formulas were developed was somebody who had experience said, that kind usually takes about 9 days. And then that kind usually takes about 3 days. And 9 and 3 went into the formula. That's not necessarily bad, but it's based on human experience. And then an algorithm was developed out of this. But it's still algorithmic. I hope your business is not going, yellow? I like that eagle. $2,000. And then the next one saying, maybe 500. It needs to be based on something. So it's algorithmic. Now, when we get to the send to the customer part, you may also have call the customer, and there's probably a process in between here where you send the image to the customer for approval. These ones might have some of this creative personal aspect. For this simplistic explanation here, this simplistic flowchart, we'll say it's sent to the customer as creative/personal. This is usually the secret sauce of your business. This is often the reason that the customer is buying from you and not from the person who has a slightly cheaper price. Maybe they're based overseas somewhere. Maybe the customer is going, I don't think I can trust that person because they don't seem to know exactly what I want. This is the part of your business you must be very careful not to mess up. And AI can mess this up really easily because it's not creative and it's not personal. Okay, so you have to make sure if you use AI here that you're not replacing the creative personal aspect of what you are already doing, but you're elevating it. Okay, so maybe you have a customer service rep that needs to send out 300 of these emails a day. Well, maybe you could train an AI that could help them write the first draft and allow them to do it twice as fast, but keep their voice, their tone of voice, and all of that stuff. We'll talk about that. So let's start from the top here. Based on the three characters that we have, Charles, May, and Barry, what could we use here? Well, probably an LLM is going to be really useful here. Now, the client request is going to have a somewhat standard format, hopefully, but in this case, there's going to be a free text part. There almost always is for this sort of thing, where the customer says, hey, I want the eagle to look more bold, or I want the color to be snap more. You know, one of these things is really hard to actually do, but they need to have some room to say that. For small businesses that do this, this is pretty common. So LLMs are super, super good at taking those kind of vague instructions that irritate humans and then turning them into an output. So what you could do is you take this client request and then you take these vague instructions, you run them through an LLM, and then that LLM, again, could be ChatGPT or a Claude model from Anthropic or something like that. And then that can actually spit out a structured output that goes into the next script in your system, the next automated piece of your system that says, style, and it could list like 3 bullet points so that when the artist gets it, they can look at those bullet points and they can refer back to the original. They've got a lot more clarity on what's going on. Create a custom image. This is probably kind of obvious, but you're going to use May. Now, here again, you have to evaluate. Is this step the secret sauce of my business? If the secret sauce of your business is that you have the most genius artists in the world, and they're producing one-of-a-kind artwork that's blowing people away, then you probably don't want to use AI here. You might be able to elevate it somehow, but you want to be careful not to get in the way of your core value. But let's say in this business, probably the artist is really evaluated on, are they meeting the customer's expectations? Are they addressing each of these things? And so something like Stable Diffusion, you might be able to find a way to say, hey, grab this product, grab this customer artwork that they provided, a reference image, or maybe 2 or 3, run some of the text that they gave us that we've processed with the LLM and that we've standardized, run this text across these reference images and produce a result. Now that result, maybe it's not good enough for the customer directly, but maybe it's a starting point that saves your artist 30 minutes or an hour. Now you've got a result that you can have the artist work on top of, and they can start getting more productive. You're often not replacing people. It should be somewhat rare that you're actually replacing an actual job. Usually what you're doing is you're elevating a job so that someone can be more productive. So let's say you fix this step, and now the artists are getting way faster. Again, if you have a process where you're sending it out to a customer, there's going to be a little piece there that says, hey, check out this artwork. And it'd be really helpful if it said, hey, I went ahead and did this. I made it more bold. I made it more, according to these images. An LLM would be a great way to do that, just by the way. So that's how you think about these steps, okay? Because there's not like a million models out there that can do anything that you want. We're not at general intelligence. We're right now at specific models that can do specific things that elevate specific processes in your business. Okay, next, create a quote. Well, goodness, an LLM could be helpful there, but you must be very careful. Creating a quote is all about coming up with specific numbers that are legally binding, specific timelines, and you probably have something that has been working for you, okay? So you don't want to replace that with an LLM completely. Because an LLM, it'll say something, but it may be totally wrong. And you can train it a little bit, but you must be very careful here that you don't give the whole thing to an LLM. But here's where an LLM can be very useful. You've got a quoting process already. Wouldn't it be nice to add a summarization piece? Hey, the reason this quote came into this is because of these factors. Oh, the reason that the timeline is this is because we're considering this, this, and this. That takes a lot of time for a human to do, and humans often forget those pieces. So if you can add some pieces that give some more value to your business, that have some textual elements to the quote, then an LLM is a great piece to go in there. So you've got your quote, you've got this image that's come out, maybe a series of images, and maybe now you've got a little bit of textual explanation going on of what came out of your quote. Now we get to the send to a customer part. Like I said, actually, wait, let me say one more thing here. The other thing that you can do with the create a quote process is you could implement a custom deep learning model. The thing here is that it's going to be expensive, but the way that you would implement it is that the custom deep learning model gets trained on all of the quotes that you've made and the quotes that have turned into business and the profit that you made and whether you hit the timeline. You're giving it that kind of a bunch of data about how successful were we. And you take that data and you train this custom deep learning model. You'll need a lot of data for this to be effective. So you have to do business and track that data for a while. But that custom deep learning model then can take the quote, where an LLM just is not smart enough to do that kind of thing. The custom deep learning model, since it's already trained on your data, it can go, hey, you had a very, very similar order, very, very similar quote 3 years ago, and you missed the timeline and you lost money. It's very similar to this quote. So I'm going to recommend, and I'm not exactly sure why I'm doing this. I'm just a deep learning model. Just this is what my training is telling me, is that you need to increase the cost by 10% and the timeline by 20%. Or, it could go the other way and say, hey, you're actually kind of overquoting this. You've done something like this before. And my suggestion is to drop the price so that we can be more competitive. So that's where a deep learning model could come in if you want to do that. That's going to be more accurate and it's going to be trained on your data and it can deal with numbers and logic because it's dealing with real data that you know is real data. Okay, does that make sense? So the last piece is sent to a customer. That's creative and personal, but there are some things you can do with an LLM. Like we said before, you are elevating. So you've already got everything combined, maybe in a PDF, maybe it's some CMS page where the customer can go to in the admin portal. And you're going to say, hey, Ron, I put together the quote for you. What do you think? But you might want to add something like, hey, how was your daughter's soccer game last week? That's a personal touch. You want to be careful that you don't rely on an LLM too much because it's going to get something wrong and people don't like fakeness. People don't like hypocrites. LLMs are essentially hypocrites. So you want to maintain that personal relationship. But here's where an LLM could be useful is you input this data manually, and then you have an LLM check it for grammar, an LLM check it for tone of voice, for clarity, for matching up with the actual quote. You can say, hey, LLM, this is the email I'm writing. This is the PDF. Check both of these and make sure they're actually the same thing. Those are great use cases for an LLM. So you're maintaining the creative and personal touch, but then you're elevating what that step is doing. So we're making fewer mistakes. We're never sending the wrong PDF with the wrong email, things like that. So this is a summary of how you think about implementing AI into your business model.